It is still dark in Rome when the senators begin to arrive. Cloaks drawn tight against the cold, sandals scraping softly over stone. The city half asleep, but the Republic already awake with fear. On this morning of March 15th, 44 BC, the air feels heavier than usual, not because of weather, but because of what men are carrying inside their chests: suspicion, ambition, dread, and the terrible knowledge that history is about to split open. Inside the theater of Pompey, where the Senate has been called to meet, the marble halls echo with murmurs that never quite become words. Julius Caesar is coming, the man who rose from scandal and debt to command armies, cross forbidden rivers, break Rome's enemies, and bend the laws of the Republic until they creaked like old wood under a storm. He is not yet 56, but he already feels like a force older than the city itself. A man who has outgrown the system meant to contain him. And today the men who once called him friend will look into his face and decide whether Rome belongs to law or to power, to tradition or to destiny, to the Senate or to Caesar. He walks toward them with the calm stride of someone who has survived too many battles to fear whispers. Wearing the plain white toga of a magistrate, not armor, because this is Rome. And in Rome, politics is supposed to be cleaner than war, even when it is not outside. A soothsayer's warning still hangs in the air like smoke: beware the Ides of March. But Caesar has always treated omens the way he treats obstacles, as things that exist to be overcome. He has survived pirates, civil wars, assassination attempts, the jealousy of aristocrats, the hunger of mobs, and the rage of the gods if the gods are real at all. He has made himself dictator, accepted honors that once belonged only to kings, sat above the Senate like a living monument. And now Rome is faced with a question it has not dared to ask in centuries. Can a republic survive the rise of a single man who is greater than it? Or must it either break him or become something else entirely? In the Senate chamber, the conspirators take their places, men of old families and sharp minds. Men who claim they love liberty, but also love their own importance. Brutus among them, carrying a name that once drove out kings. Cassius with his cold bitterness, and others whose hands will soon be red. They do not shout, they do not rage. They do not look like villains, they look like Romans. Controlled, disciplined, respectable, and that is what makes the moment terrifying. Because the most dangerous violence in history often comes dressed as duty. Caesar steps inside, the meeting begins. And in the silence between greetings and formalities, the Republic holds its breath. Because somewhere in the next few minutes a blade will move. A body will fall, and Rome will never return to what it was. Yet the story of Caesar cannot begin with his death alone. Because the Ides of March was not a sudden storm. It was the final crack of thunder after years of pressure building under the surface of Roman life. A pressure created by conquest, corruption, inequality, and the slow collapse of an old system that had once been designed for a small city of farmers and soldiers, not for a Mediterranean empire stretching from Spain to Syria. Roman Caesar's time is a paradox, magnificent and rotten at once. The streets are crowded with citizens and foreigners, freedmen and slaves, merchants and beggars, soldiers on leave and politicians on their way to bribe someone. The smell of bread and sweat and smoke hangs over the city, and above it all rise the temples and basilicas, the symbols of a republic that claims to be eternal. But the people know the truth in their bones. The old order is failing. The Senate speaks of tradition while enriching itself. The aristocrats speak of virtue while buying elections. And the common people, the plebs, survive on cheap grain and promises that never last. The Republic is ruled by men who fear kings yet behave like kings behind closed doors. Men who compete for power not through open dictatorship, but through networks of patronage, alliances, debts, and intimidation. And this is the world that produced Julius Caesar, a man both shaped by Rome's sickness and gifted with the brilliance to exploit it. He was born into an ancient family, the Julii, who claimed a descent from Venus herself through Aeneas. But the glory of that lineage could not hide the reality. Caesar's branch of the family was not rich, not dominant, not secure. Rome's nobility was crowded and ruthless. And noble blood alone did not guarantee success, it only guaranteed expectation. And Caesar grew up in a city where the difference between greatness and ruin could be decided by a single election, a single speech, a single betrayal. The politics of Rome were not polite debates, they were war conducted in togas. And Caesar learned early that if he wanted to rise, he would need more than ancestry. He would need courage, charm, patience, and a mind sharp enough to see the hidden currents beneath every public gesture. He lived in a Rome that had already tasted civil blood, where generals marched on their own city and the streets had seen the terror of proscriptions. Lists of enemies posted in the forum. Men hunted like animals, their wealth seized, their heads displayed as warnings. The memory of Sulla's dictatorship still haunted the older senators, like a nightmare that could return at any moment. And for the younger generation, it offered a darker lesson. That power belongs to the man willing to take it, not the man who politely asks for it. Caesar watched this world and understood something most men refuse to admit. The Republic was not a sacred machine of laws. It was a battlefield of human ambition. And those who pretended otherwise were either fools or liars. And yet Caesar also understood something else. That Rome was not held together by fear alone. It was held together by myth. By the story Romans told themselves about who they were. A people who hated kings, who valued liberty, who believed their ancestors had built a system where no single man could dominate. And that myth was powerful enough that even Caesar, as he climbed higher and higher, had to pretend he respected it. He could not call himself king. He could not openly destroy the Senate. He had to wear the mask of the Republic, even as he hollowed it out from within. And that is why the Ides of March is so haunting. Because it is not simply the murder of a man, it is the moment when the mask falls. When the senators who claim to defend liberty choose assassination over law. And the dictator who claims to serve Rome discovers that Rome will not forgive him for becoming what it secretly needed. As Caesar stands in the Senate chamber, surrounded by men whose faces reveal nothing, the Republic is already dying. Because a system that cannot resolve its conflicts except through violence is a system that has lost its soul. The conspirators will strike in the name of freedom, but they will unleash a chain of consequences they cannot control. And Caesar, in the last seconds of his life, will see not only the knives but the truth. That Rome was never stable, never pure, never safe. It was always one ambition away from collapse, and in that moment, as the first blade moves and the first cry breaks the air, history will turn its face toward empire. And the world will enter a new age written not by votes and speeches, but by legions and emperors. And to understand how Rome reached this point, we must go back to the young Caesar, before the crowns and titles, before the civil war, before the Rubicon, when he was only a boy watching powerful men tear his city apart, learning in silence what it would take to survive and what it would take to rule. Julius Caesar's story begins not with glory but with danger, because Rome in his youth was not the stable republic later writers pretend it was. It was a city trembling under the weight of its own expansion, where victory abroad had poisoned politics at home, and the streets were ruled as much by gangs and intimidation as by law. Caesar was born in 100 BC into the ancient Julian clan, a family that carried legendary prestige, but not the kind of wealth that could guarantee safety. And from the beginning he lived in a world where names mattered. Alliances mattered, and one wrong connection could destroy you. His childhood unfolded in the Suburra, a crowded district of Rome filled with noise, smoke, taverns, workshops, and the restless energy of ordinary life. Far from the polished marble of the Senate, but close enough to feel its consequences. Because when the Republic's elite fought, it was the people who bled. And the Republic in these years was tearing itself in two. On one side stood the optimates, the conservative aristocrats who claimed to defend tradition. On the other stood the populaires, politicians who appealed to the masses to break the Senate's grip on power. And the struggle between them was not about ideology alone. It was about survival, land, money, and control of the armies that now decided everything. Caesar's family leaned toward the populaires, and that meant he grew up under the shadow of one of the most feared men in Roman history, Gaius Marius, the brilliant general who had saved Rome from foreign invasion and then turned his power inward. Marius was connected to Caesar by marriage, and in Rome, that connection was both an opportunity and a death sentence depending on who was winning. Because Rome had entered an age where generals did not retire quietly, they marched on the city itself. And when Caesar was still young, the Republic was seized by civil war. Sulla, another general, returned from the east with hardened legions and did what no Roman was supposed to do. He entered Rome as a conqueror. He declared himself dictator, and he began to purge his enemies with cold efficiency. The proscriptions were announced like public business. Lists of condemned men posted in the forum. Anyone could kill them and claim a reward. Their property was confiscated, their families ruined. And Rome learned that law was only a tool in the hands of power. Caesar watched the city change under Sulla's shadow. He watched fear settle into the stones. He watched senators smile while their rivals disappeared. And he learned that in Rome mercy was not a virtue, it was a weakness that could be punished. Then came the moment that nearly ended him before he began. Sulla demanded Caesar divorce his wife Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, a leader of the populaires and an enemy of Sulla's faction. It was a political command disguised as a personal matter, a test of obedience, and most young men would have complied instantly. Because refusal meant death, but Caesar refused. And in that refusal we see the first glimpse of the man he would become. Proud, stubborn, unwilling to be controlled. Even when the cost was everything, Sulla stripped him of his priesthood, his inheritance, his social protection. And Caesar became a hunted man, moving through Rome in disguise, sleeping in different houses, bribing officials, surviving by nerve and luck until friends intervened and Sulla finally relented. But even then the dictator is said to have warned, "There is many a Marius in this Caesar." A prophecy spoken with contempt but also with fear. Because Sulla recognized something dangerous in the young aristocrat, a talent for ambition that could not be trained into obedience. Caesar escaped Rome for a time, serving in Asia Minor as a junior officer. And there he began to build the skills that would later shake the world. He learned discipline in the army. He learned the language of command. And he learned that men follow confidence even more than they follow rank. At the siege of Mytilene, he reportedly earned the civic crown for saving a fellow soldier's life, a rare honor that marked him early as brave. But Caesar's true weapon was not his sword, it was his mind. Because even in his early 20s, he understood that Rome rewarded not just courage, but performance. Reputation, the ability to be seen as great before you truly were. And so he returned to Rome, determined to craft himself into something larger than his circumstances. He studied rhetoric with obsessive intensity, because in Rome speech was power. The courts and assemblies were arenas where a man could destroy an enemy or build a following. And Caesar's voice, controlled, elegant, sharp, became one of the most dangerous instruments in the city. Yet even as he climbed, fate tested him again in a way that would become legend. While traveling across the Aegean, he was captured by pirates, a common threat in the Mediterranean, and most men would have begged. But Caesar did something else. He laughed. He demanded they raise the ransom because he was worth more. He lived among them as if he were their superior, writing poetry, ordering them around, joking that when he was freed, he would return and crucify them. The pirates thought it was humor, but Caesar was never joking. When the ransom was paid and he was released, he gathered ships, hunted them down, captured them, and crucified them exactly as he promised, granting them the small mercy of having their throats cut first. And in that story, Rome would later recognize the pattern of his life. A man who treated danger as insult, who refused humiliation, who answered threats not with panic but with ruthless action. By the time Caesar returned to Rome again, he was no longer merely surviving. He was shaping himself into the kind of man the Republic could not ignore. And yet beneath the confidence there was still something unfinished. Because Caesar was not born into the highest tier of Rome's ruling class, he had to climb through offices, through debts, through alliances, through calculated risk. And in the next stage of his life, he would begin the real ascent. Not through war yet, but through politics, through the art of making enemies fear you and making the people love you. Because Caesar understood the most important truth of the late Republic. Rome was not ruled by laws, it was ruled by crowds, by money and by soldiers, and if you could master all three, you could master the world. When Caesar stepped fully into Roman politics, he entered a world where every smile was a calculation and every friendship came with a hidden knife. Because the Republic in the 1st century BC was less a government than a competitive arena for aristocrats who treated power like a birthright and elections like battles. Caesar understood this immediately, and he also understood something most senators refused to admit: that Rome's empire had grown too vast for its old institutions. The Senate still pretended it ruled through debate and tradition, but real control now flowed through wealth, patronage, and above all military command. And Caesar, still a young man without an army of his own, began the only way a Roman could begin, by building a public image so bright it could blind his rivals. He prosecuted corrupt governors in the courts, not purely out of justice but because trials were theater and Rome loved spectacle when it was wrapped in moral language. He spoke with precision, with controlled fury, and he learned how to turn the crowd's anger into his own momentum. Then he began spending money he did not have. A decision that would seem reckless if it were not so perfectly Roman. Because in Rome, debt was not shameful if it purchased influence. And Caesar spent like a man investing in a future empire. He hosted games, banquets, public entertainments. He gave the people what they wanted: bread, excitement, the feeling that someone powerful saw them. And in return, they began to see him as their champion. But none of this came without cost, because Caesar's generosity was funded by loans. And the men who lent him money did not do so out of kindness. They did it because they believed Caesar would one day repay them with power. The greatest of these creditors was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. A man who had made fortunes through fire sales and property seizures during Sulla's proscriptions. A man who wanted glory but lacked Caesar's charm. And so he attached himself to Caesar like a shadow, using wealth to buy what money alone could not create: popularity. And Caesar, pragmatic and fearless, accepted. He climbed a cursus honorum, the ladder of offices, becoming questor, then aedile, and in each role he made himself visible. As aedile, he decorated Rome with extravagant displays, repaired public buildings, staged games so lavish they seemed impossible. And the people adored him, but the Senate watched with tightening suspicion. Because they understood what Caesar was doing, he was buying love. And love in Rome was political capital, more dangerous than legions. Then came the moment that proved Caesar was willing to gamble everything. He ran for Pontifex Maximus, the chief priesthood of Rome, a position of immense prestige and lifelong influence, and he ran against older, more established men who expected victory as a matter of dignity. Caesar campaigned like a man possessed, bribing voters openly, promising favors, spending more borrowed money than anyone thought sane. And on election day he won, shocking the aristocracy. And as he left his house that morning, He is said to have told his mother he would return either as Pontifex Maximus or not at all, because if he lost, he would be ruined. Debt would swallow him, his enemies would crush him. And this was Caesar's pattern. He did not climb carefully, he leapt. And somehow the ground always rose to meet him. Now installed in a grand house on the sacred way, the center of Rome's religious life, he gained not just honor but protection. Because even his enemies hesitated to attack the city's highest priest too directly, yet the Republic was boiling. And Caesar's rise was happening in a Rome haunted by the memory of Spartacus' rebellion, by the growing power of Pompey the Great, and by the endless wars that fed Rome's hunger, but also fed its instability. Pompey was everything Caesar was not yet. A legendary general, adored by his soldiers, celebrated with triumphs, the man who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and expanded Rome's reach in the east. And Pompey's fame was so overwhelming that other senators could only survive by aligning with him or undermining him. While Crassus, despite his wealth, burned with resentment that Pompey possessed the military glory he could not buy. And so Rome's politics became a triangle of ambition. Pompey with his prestige, Crassus with his money, Caesar with his charisma and ruthless intelligence. And Caesar understood that if he remained alone, he would be crushed. Because the Senate could tolerate a popular man, but it could not tolerate a popular man who might one day command armies. So Caesar began building alliances. Not through friendship, but through necessity. He married strategically, divorcing and remarrying to link himself with powerful families. And he gave his own daughter Julia to Pompey in marriage. A brilliant move, because Julia was loved by Pompey genuinely. And for a time that marriage softened the rivalry between them, making Pompey less likely to see Caesar as a threat. Then in 60 B, Caesar engineered the most important political agreement of his life, the First Triumvirate, an unofficial alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Three men who did not trust each other, but needed each other. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements. Crassus wanted financial concessions for his business allies. Caesar wanted the consulship and a military command that could give him the one thing he lacked: an army loyal to him alone. The Senate despised this alliance because it made a mockery of Republican tradition. Power now lived in private meetings, not public debate, and Caesar, elected consul in 59 BC, used his office aggressively, pushing laws through the assembly over senatorial opposition, intimidating opponents, using gangs in the streets when persuasion failed. And when senators tried to block him, he simply went around them. Because Caesar understood that legality in Rome was flexible. What mattered was force backed by popularity, and yet Caesar was careful. He always framed his actions as serving the people, defending justice, restoring fairness. Even as he was dismantling the system that claimed to protect those ideals, his enemies hated him, called him a demagogue, a tyrant in training. But Caesar did not care, because he was playing a longer game. And when his consulship ended, he secured what he truly wanted: a proconsular command in Gaul, a region on Rome's frontier, dangerous, unstable, filled with tribes Rome had not fully subdued. It was the perfect stage. Far enough from Rome that he could operate with freedom, close enough that victory would bring immense prestige. And most importantly, it gave him legions, real power. The kind of power that made Senate speeches meaningless. As Caesar left Rome for Gaul, his creditors watched. His rivals hoped he would fail, and the people cheered. But Caesar knew what he was doing. He was stepping into the world of war, not as a soldier seeking honor, but as a politician seeking dominance. And in the forests and rivers of Gaul, he would transform himself from a rising statesman into a legend. And he would also transform the Republic into something that could no longer survive him. Gaul was not a single country, but a vast and restless patchwork of tribes. Rival kings, fortified hill towns, sacred groves, and shifting alliances. And when Caesar arrived in 58 B.C., he did not step into a clean war with clear boundaries. He stepped into a living storm of politics, migration, fear, and opportunity. The Roman Senate had given him command over Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul, provinces that bordered the wild lands beyond. But Caesar's ambition was larger than any legal assignment, because he understood that Rome rewarded conquest with power and forgave almost everything to a man who delivered victory. And so he looked north and saw not merely enemies, but the raw material of his future greatness. The first crisis came quickly. The Helvetii, a large tribal confederation, were attempting to migrate across Gaul, driven by pressure from Germanic peoples, burning their own settlements behind them, moving with families, wagons, livestock, an entire nation on the march. And to Rome this looked like invasion. To Caesar it looked like the perfect opening. He blocked their route, built fortifications with astonishing speed, and forced them into battle. The campaign was brutal and exhausting, fought across rivers and rough terrain, but Caesar won. And when the Helvetii were defeated, he did not simply scatter them. He ordered them back to their homeland, not out of mercy but strategy, because he wanted a buffer zone against Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine. Already he was thinking like an empire builder, not merely a general. Then came Ariovistus, a Germanic king who had crossed into Gaul with warriors and was threatening Roman influence. Many Roman commanders would have hesitated. Ariovistus was fierce, his men were hardened, and the Roman legions were still adapting to the unfamiliar landscape. But Caesar saw another chance to become indispensable. He marched, negotiated briefly, then fought, and the battle was decisive. Caesar's legions held, the Germanic line broke, and Ariovistus fled back across the Rhine. For Rome this was security, for Caesar it was legend. He had driven back the barbarians, he had protected Gaul. He had proven himself a commander of speed and nerve. But Caesar's victories were not only military. They were narrative because he wrote about them, sending dispatches back to Rome crafted with careful simplicity, presenting himself as rational, restrained, always forced into war by necessity, always acting for Rome's safety. And these reports, later shaped into his commentaries on the Gallic War, were masterpieces of propaganda. Rome read them and saw Caesar not as a dangerous, ambitious politician, but as a heroic defender of civilization. And with each season his army grew more loyal because Caesar paid them well, shared hardship, rewarded bravery, spoke to them as comrades, and created the most powerful bond in the ancient world, the bond between a general and the men who would die for him. In 57 BC, he turned against the Belgae in northern Gaul, tribes Rome considered the fiercest, and he defeated them through relentless campaigning, building bridges, storming forts, forcing surrender after surrender. Then he pushed west against the Veneti, a seafaring people who fought from ships and coastal strongholds. And Caesar adapted again, constructing a fleet, learning naval warfare, and crushing them. The leaders were executed, the people sold into slavery, a harsh punishment meant to terrify others into submission. And this is where Caesar's greatness reveals its shadow, because his conquest was not a romantic adventure. It was empire, and empire is built with blood. Villages burned, hostages taken, entire populations displaced. And Caesar understood that fear was a weapon as necessary as steel. By 55 BC, he had reached a point where Gaul was not enough. He needed something spectacular, something no Roman commander had done. So he built a bridge across the Rhine in just 10 days. A feat of engineering meant as much to impress as to invade. He crossed with his legions, marched briefly into German territory, then withdrew, sending a message: Rome can reach you anywhere. Then he turned his gaze toward the ocean and the misty island beyond. Britannia, a land of myth and trade, barely known to Rome. And he launched an expedition across the Channel, the first Roman to do so. The invasion was difficult, storms damaged ships. The Britons fought fiercely, and Caesar achieved no permanent conquest. But he did not need it, because in Rome perception was reality. And Caesar had crossed into the unknown, expanding the map of Roman imagination. He returned again the next year with a larger force, pushed inland, forced tribes into submission, took hostages, then withdrew once more, and again Rome celebrated him. Because he was doing what Rome believed it was born to do: to expand, to dominate, to turn the world into a stage for Roman greatness. Yet beneath the triumphs, the resistance in Gaul was growing, because the tribes were learning, adapting, and they began to see Caesar not as a temporary raider, but as an existential threat. And in 52 BC, that resistance erupted into full rebellion under one of the most remarkable leaders Rome ever faced. Vercingetorix, a young Arvernian noble who united tribes through charisma and ruthless discipline, burning his own lands to deny Caesar supplies, forcing the Romans into hunger and frustration, and Caesar, for the first time in years, faced the possibility of real failure. The campaign became desperate. Battles were fierce, and the climax came at Alesia, a fortified hilltop city where Vercingetorix made his stand. Caesar did something extraordinary. He surrounded the city with a massive ring of fortifications. Walls, trenches, towers, traps, a siege line to starve the defenders. But then a relief army of Gauls arrived to break the siege, and Caesar built a second ring of fortifications facing outward. Trapping himself between two enemies, the Romans fought on two fronts, day after day, in rain and mud and blood. And for a moment, it nearly collapsed. But Caesar personally rode where the fighting was thickest, rallying troops, pushing reserves, holding the line through sheer will, and in the end, the Gauls broke. Vercingetorix surrendered, riding out in full armor, laying down his weapons at Caesar's feet. And with that surrender, Gaul was effectively conquered. Caesar had won one of the greatest campaigns in Roman history, and he had gained something more dangerous than territory. He had gained an army of veterans who worshipped him, a fortune from plunder and tribute, and a reputation that made him untouchable. But while Caesar was becoming a legend in Gaul, Rome was changing without him. Because the triumvirate was breaking. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's beloved wife, died in childbirth, severing the emotional bond between the two men. Then Crassus, hungry for glory, marched east against Parthia and was destroyed at Carrhae. His army annihilated, his head taken as a trophy. And with Crassus gone, the balance of power collapsed, leaving only Caesar and Pompey. Two giants now destined to collide. The Senate, terrified of Caesar's growing power, began to cling to Pompey as their protector, offering him honors, command, legitimacy, turning him slowly from Caesar's ally into Caesar's rival. And Caesar, still in Gaul, understood the truth before anyone said it aloud. The Republic could not contain two men like this, and soon it would demand that one of them kneel, and Caesar was not built to kneel. By the time Caesar finished conquering Gaul, the Republic was already preparing to devour him, because Rome could forgive almost anything except a man who became too great to control. And Caesar had become exactly that. He had spent nearly a decade in the north turning a frontier command into a personal empire. And now he stood at the edge of Italy with battle-hardened legions, unimaginable wealth, and a name that made crowds roar. The Senate looked at him and saw not a servant of the Republic, but a second Sulla, a man who might march on Rome and crown himself king. And the fear was not irrational. It was the natural consequence of a system that had trained its greatest men to seek power through war, then pretended to be shocked when they returned with armies. Pompey, once Caesar's partner, had drifted into the Senate's embrace. He was granted extraordinary authority to maintain order in Italy, and slowly he became the symbol of law against Caesar's ambition. Yet the truth was more complicated, because Pompey also feared Caesar, not only for Rome's sake but for his own. He had been the greatest Roman alive, the man of triumphs, and now Caesar's victories in Gaul threatened to eclipse him completely. Politics in Rome turned into a cold civil countdown. The Senate demanded Caesar disband his army and return as a private citizen to stand for office legally. But Caesar knew what that meant. Without his imperium, he would be vulnerable to prosecution by enemies who had waited years to destroy him. Charges of illegal warfare, bribery, violence, and corruption would bury him. And once buried, he would be forgotten. While Pompey would stand alone at the top, Caesar attempted compromise, offering to surrender his command if Pompey did the same, but the Senate refused, because they did not want balance. They wanted Caesar weakened, and as negotiations failed, the language of law became the language of threat. Ultimatums were issued, deadlines set, and behind every sentence stood armed force. Caesar remained in Ravenna, the northern Italian town that marked the legal boundary of his command, and there he waited with the weight of history pressing on him. Because one small river separated him from rebellion, the Rubicon. Roman law forbade a general from bringing his army into Italy. Crossing it with troops was treason. It meant civil war. It meant the end of the Republic's illusion that military power could be kept outside politics. And on a winter night in January 49 BC, Caesar made his decision. Not in a grand ceremony, but in a moment of quiet resolve. He led the 13th Legion to the river, paused, and then crossed. According to later tradition, he spoke the words that would echo for 2,000 years. The die is cast, and in that step Caesar did not merely march into Italy. He marched into a new world where law would be replaced by force, and force would be justified by destiny. Rome panicked, senators fled, Pompey fled, because Caesar moved with speed that stunned everyone. He took towns without resistance, offered clemency, avoided unnecessary slaughter, and that was part of his genius. He understood that terror could win battles, but mercy could win a country. He wanted Romans to see him not as a tyrant, but as a savior. So he presented himself as defending the rights of the tribunes, protecting the people from a corrupt Senate, restoring justice. And the crowds believed him because they wanted to believe him, because the Republic had failed them for generations. Pompey retreated south, unable to raise enough forces quickly, and soon he evacuated Italy entirely, sailing to Greece where he could gather legions from the eastern provinces. Caesar entered Rome almost without a fight, a victory achieved not through siege but through momentum. Yet even in triumph, he behaved carefully. He did not massacre senators. He did not declare himself king. He spoke of peace, of unity, of reconciliation. But the Republic's heart had already stopped beating, because the Senate had abandoned the city and Caesar now controlled the treasury, the laws, and the streets. He was appointed dictator temporarily to hold elections, then resigned the title, a performance meant to show restraint. But everyone understood that restraint was now his choice, not Rome's. Caesar's next move was as bold as his crossing of the Rubicon. He pursued Pompey's allies in Spain, where Pompeian legions threatened his rear. He marched with speed across mountains and rivers, surrounded enemy forces, forced surrender through skillful maneuver. And again he offered mercy, releasing captured soldiers, sending them home, turning enemies into reluctant admirers, because Caesar was fighting a civil war. And in civil war, the greatest victory is not killing your countrymen, but convincing them you are inevitable. Then he turned east toward Pompey himself. And the confrontation that would decide the fate of Rome approached like a storm over the sea. Pompey had assembled a massive army in Greece, larger than Caesar's, supported by senators, nobles, and the wealth of the eastern provinces. They believed Caesar's audacity would finally meet its limit, that his luck would break. But Caesar crossed the Adriatic in winter storms, landing with fewer troops than he wanted, because even the sea seemed to resist him. For months he struggled, short of supplies, surrounded by enemies, yet his confidence never cracked. He wrote letters, rallied his men, and waited for the moment to strike. The two armies met near Pharsalus in 48 BC, on a dry plain where dust rose under marching feet, and the fate of the Republic hung in the balance. Pompey's army was larger, his cavalry stronger, his position better, and his senators expected an easy victory. But Pompey hesitated, cautious by nature, unwilling to risk everything, while Caesar understood that hesitation is death in war. He arranged his legions with a hidden reserve line to counter Pompey's cavalry. And when the battle began, Pompey's horsemen charged, sweeping Caesar's flank, but Caesar's hidden troops rose like a trap snapping shut. They drove the cavalry back with brutal discipline, then turned and struck the exposed Pompeian infantry. The line collapsed, panic spread, and the battle became slaughter. Caesar won one of the most decisive victories in Roman history. Pompey fled, his greatness shattered in a single afternoon. And Caesar, standing amid the dead, looked not like a liberator, but like a man who had just broken the last pillar holding up the old world. Pompey escaped to Egypt seeking refuge, but Egypt was ruled by a young king, Ptolemy XIII, and his advisors believed they could win Caesar's favor by eliminating his rival. So when Pompey landed, he was murdered on the shore, stabbed by men pretending to greet him. His head cut off, his body left in the sand. And when Caesar arrived and was presented with Pompey's head, he did not rejoice, he wept. Because Caesar understood something terrifying, that Rome had now entered a phase where even its greatest men could be butchered like criminals. And with Pompey dead, Caesar stood alone, but the war was not over, because Rome's wounds were deeper than any one battle, and Caesar's victory would soon drag him into the seductive, dangerous world of Egypt, where another legend waited: Cleopatra. Egypt was not merely a province on Rome's map. It was an ancient world unto itself, older than the Republic, older than Rome's myths, a kingdom of temples and river gods, of grain that fed the Mediterranean, of wealth so vast it could buy armies and bribe senators. And when Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, he stepped into a palace of marble and incense, where politics was as lethal as any battlefield. The city glittered with Hellenistic splendor, libraries and colonnades, statues of gods that watched with stone eyes, and crowds speaking Greek, Egyptian, Latin, a crossroads of empires. But beneath the beauty was a civil war between siblings. Ptolemy XIII, a boy king controlled by advisors, and Cleopatra VII, his older sister, sharp-minded, ambitious, already forced into exile. Both claimed the throne, and Caesar, newly victorious and exhausted from chasing Pompey, suddenly found himself dragged into their conflict, because Rome's power was now so great that even Egyptian kings needed Roman approval to rule. Caesar demanded payment of Egypt's debts to Rome and ordered the siblings to reconcile. But reconciliation was impossible. And then Cleopatra made the move that would change her life and Caesar's. She entered the palace secretly, smuggled in past guards, according to legend wrapped in a carpet or a sack, and when it was opened, before Caesar she appeared not as a trembling supplicant, but as a queen. Young, intelligent, fearless, speaking with confidence in a world where most rulers trembled before Rome, Cleopatra understood something essential about Caesar. He was not seduced by beauty alone. He was seduced by brilliance, by daring, by the sense that he was facing someone who could match him in will. And Cleopatra offered him what no Roman woman could: the feeling of stepping into an older, richer, more mysterious world. And she also offered him strategy. If Caesar backed her, he could control Egypt, secure its grain, and place a loyal ruler on the throne. The boy king's faction reacted with fury. They surrounded Caesar's small force in Alexandria, and suddenly the conqueror of Gaul was trapped in a city far from his legions, fighting for survival in narrow streets and palace corridors. The Alexandrian War was chaotic, a struggle of ships, fire, and desperate skirmishes. And in the chaos, the city's great library may have suffered damage, a tragedy that later generations would mourn as the loss of countless books and knowledge. Caesar fought with his usual nerve, holding the harbor, sending for reinforcements, refusing to retreat. And when the Nile floods rose and the fighting reached its climax, Ptolemy's army was defeated, the young king drowned while fleeing, and Cleopatra emerged as the undisputed ruler, installed by Caesar's power. And then something happened that scandalized Rome and revealed Caesar's growing separation from republican norms. Instead of rushing back to finish the civil war, Caesar stayed. He traveled with Cleopatra up the Nile in a luxurious barge, surrounded by guards, musicians, and the symbols of monarchy, moving through landscapes of temples and palm groves, a Roman dictator drifting like a pharaoh. And to many Romans this looked like betrayal, because Rome's greatest fear was not simply kings. It was being ruled by foreign kings, yet Caesar did not care. He had won too much to fear gossip, and Cleopatra soon bore him a son, Caesarion, a child who embodied a dangerous possibility, that Caesar might found a dynasty not in Rome but in the East, that he might become not merely dictator but king in truth. And while Caesar lingered in Egypt, the Republic's remaining resistance flared elsewhere. Pompey's supporters regrouped, his sons raised armies, and in Africa, the senatorial faction allied with King Juba of Numidia. Determined to fight on, Caesar finally returned to war, moving with relentless speed, crushing opposition in a series of brutal campaigns. At Zela in Asia Minor, he defeated Pharnacus so quickly he sent Rome the famous message, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. A sentence so simple, it sounded like destiny speaking. Then he turned to Africa and faced the hardened Republican forces at Thapsus in 46 BC, where elephants charged and Roman legions met Roman legions again, and Caesar won. The Republican leader Cato, symbol of stubborn virtue, refused to surrender and took his own life at Utica, dying by his own hand rather than live under Caesar's mercy. And Caesar, who had offered clemency so often, now began to show signs of a harder edge. Because civil war changes men, it teaches them that mercy can be mistaken for weakness, and weakness invites rebellion. He returned to Rome in triumph, celebrating multiple victories with grand processions, captives, treasures, banners, and the crowd cheered him as if he were a god. But the Senate watched with a fear that was becoming hatred, because Caesar's triumphs were not just celebrations. They were declarations that he stood above all others. And then came the honors, the slow, deliberate construction of monarchy without the name. Caesar was appointed dictator for 10 years, then dictator for life. His image appeared on coins. Something once reserved for gods, his statue was placed among the kings of Rome. He was granted the right to wear the laurel wreath and purple robe, symbols of royal authority. Senators rose when he entered, some out of respect, others out of terror. And Caesar accepted it all, perhaps believing he was stabilizing Rome, perhaps believing he deserved it, perhaps simply unable to stop because power is addictive and he had tasted it fully. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that would shape time itself for centuries. He expanded the Senate, redistributed land to veterans, planned massive building projects, granted citizenship, reduced debt pressures, and in many ways he acted like a visionary ruler, trying to repair a broken system. But the more he fixed Rome, the more he revealed that Rome could be ruled by one man. And that realization was fatal, because the Republic's elite could tolerate reforms. They could not tolerate the proof that they were unnecessary. Cleopatra even visited Rome, staying in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, and her presence was like a spark near dry wood. Senators whispered that Caesar would marry her, move the capital, crown himself king, even if these rumors were exaggerated. The fear behind them was real. Rome's identity was built on hatred of kings, and Caesar was becoming king in everything but name. And in the shadows of this growing monarchy, men who had once fought beside him began to believe they had only one choice left: to kill him before he killed the Republic. Among them was Brutus, a man torn between personal loyalty and ancestral duty. Because Brutus owed Caesar his life, Caesar had spared him after Pharsalus, treated him with honor, perhaps even loved him like a son. But Brutus also carried the burden of his family legend, the Brutus who expelled Rome's kings, the Brutus whose name meant liberty itself. And Cassius, sharper, colder, more resentful, fed that conflict like poison, reminding Brutus that Caesar's mercy was a chain, that Rome's freedom was slipping away, that soon there would be no Senate, only servants. The conspirators gathered quietly, senators, praetors, men who called themselves liberators, and they did not plan a civil war, they planned a surgical act. A single murder that they believed would restore the Republic, as if killing one man could reverse decades of decay. And as they prepared, Caesar continued living with the calm confidence of someone who had survived too much to fear whispers. He ignored warnings, dismissed omens, refused a bodyguard, because he believed his greatness made him untouchable, and perhaps it did, until the morning it did not. Until the Ides of March arrived, and the Republic, trembling with fear and hope, waited for the knives. The last days before the Ides of March were filled with signs that men later pretended to have understood, because history always makes prophets out of survivors. But in truth, Rome moved toward Caesar's death the way a sleepwalker moves toward a cliff, with awareness flickering and then fading. Caesar had returned from war with the confidence of a man who believed he had ended chaos. Yet the city around him felt more unstable than ever. Senators smiled and bowed while privately measuring the distance between their dignity and their humiliation. The people loved Caesar because he fed them, entertained them, forgave debts, and spoke like a man who belonged to them more than to the aristocracy. But love in Rome was fickle, and the same crowd that cheered could turn if hunger returned or if another hero appeared. Caesar's closest allies urged him to be cautious. But caution was not a habit Caesar had ever mastered. He moved through Rome as if he were already immortal. And the honors piled higher, a golden chair in the Senate, a month renamed after him, priests offering vows for his safety, statues raised in his image, and each honor was meant as flattery but felt like a provocation. Because the Republic's elite did not simply fear Caesar's power, they feared what his power said about them, that they were irrelevant, that their ancestral authority could be brushed aside by one man with soldiers and popular support. Rumors spread that Caesar planned to leave Rome soon for a great eastern campaign against Parthia, to avenge Crassus, to conquer lands beyond imagination. And some believed he would return as a king crowned by victory. Others believed he would never return at all, leaving Rome in the hands of his supporters. And this uncertainty made the conspirators desperate, because if Caesar left with an army, killing him would become impossible. The decision had to be made now, and so the plot hardened, not in taverns or dark alleys, but in the very heart of Rome's political class. Men met in private houses, whispered in porticos, passed notes in the Senate, each one telling himself he was acting for liberty, even as ambition and fear mixed in his blood. Cassius drove the conspiracy with relentless intensity. Because he had fought in the Civil War, he had watched Caesar rise above all men, and he could not accept living as a lesser figure in Caesar's shadow. But Cassius knew he needed Brutus, not for skill but for legitimacy, because Brutus' name carried moral weight. It sounded like the Republic itself speaking. And Brutus was the one man Caesar trusted enough that his betrayal would shock the world. Brutus struggled, torn between gratitude and ideology. Between Caesar the friend and Caesar the threat, he walked Rome's streets at night, reading old texts, thinking of ancestors, feeling the invisible pressure of expectation. And slowly he convinced himself that Caesar's death was not murder but sacrifice, a necessary wound to save the body of the state. Once Brutus joined, others followed. Because men who hesitate alone often move quickly once they feel surrounded by certainty. The conspirators swore an oath. Some wanted to include Cicero, the great orator, but Brutus refused, believing Cicero too cautious, too attached to legality. The plot needed action, not speeches, and they agreed Caesar must die in the Senate, in public, so the act would appear political, not personal, and they decided no one else should be killed. Not Antony, not Lepidus, not Caesar's supporters. because they believed Rome would return to normal once the tyrant was removed. It was the greatest miscalculation of their lives, because Rome had not been normal for decades, and one man's death could not restore a system already rotting from within. As the day approached, Caesar received warnings: a soothsayer's words, strange dreams, uneasy whispers from friends, and on the night before the Ides, his wife Calpurnia dreamed of his statue pouring blood while Romans washed their hands in it. She begged him not to go to the Senate, and for a moment, Caesar hesitated, because even the bravest men have private fears. But Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators, arrived and persuaded him, telling him that staying home would make him look weak, that senators would mock him, that they had planned honors for him and would feel insulted. And Caesar, proud as always, chose reputation over caution. He rose, dressed, and walked toward the meeting. As he moved through the streets, Rome watched him, some with admiration, some with hatred, most with curiosity, because Caesar had become a spectacle, the center of gravity around which the city turned. He passed the soothsayer and reportedly said, "The Ides of March have come," and the soothsayer replied, "Yes, but they have not gone." And then Caesar reached the theater of Pompey, a place heavy with irony, because Pompey had built it. And now Caesar would die beneath Pompey's shadow. The Senate chamber was crowded. The conspirators positioned themselves around Caesar like respectful colleagues, each one hiding tension behind calm eyes. Antony, Caesar's loyal friend and powerful lieutenant, was lured away by one of the conspirators in a distraction, leaving Caesar exposed. The signal was given when Julius Caesar approached Caesar with a petition, pleading for the recall of his exiled brother. Caesar refused, irritated, and Caesar grabbed his toga. An act of shocking disrespect. Caesar rose in anger, and in that instant, the first blade struck. Casca, nervous and trembling, stabbed awkwardly at Caesar's neck. The wound was shallow. Caesar spun, shouting in disbelief, "You villain, what are you doing?" The room exploded. Senators leapt back in horror. The conspirators surged forward, knives flashing, not in theatrical elegance, but in messy violence. Because killing a man is always uglier than imagination. Caesar fought at first, grabbing Casca's arm, trying to defend himself, but then he saw Brutus, and something changed. Because betrayal is not merely physical, it is psychological. It breaks the mind before it breaks the body. Whether Caesar spoke the famous words, "Et tu, brute," is uncertain, but the meaning is real. Caesar recognized that the man he trusted was among those killing him. And in that moment, he stopped resisting, pulling his toga over his head, falling beneath the statue of Pompey, his blood soaking the floor. And the conspirators, hands dripping, stood over him trembling with triumph and shock. Because they had done it, they had killed the dictator. They had killed the most powerful man in the world. And for a heartbeat, they believed they had saved the Republic. But outside the chamber, Rome did not erupt into celebration. It froze because ordinary people do not rejoice when power collapses. They fear what comes next. The conspirators stepped into the forum, shouting liberty, waving bloody daggers, expecting applause. But the crowd stared in silence, backing away. And in that silence, the liberators began to understand that they had not restored the Republic. They had simply opened the door to something darker. Because Caesar was dead, but Caesar's shadow was only beginning. The murder of Caesar did not restore the Republic. It exposed how little Republic was left to restore. Because the conspirators had imagined Rome as a patient that could be cured by removing a single diseased organ. But Rome was a body already infected everywhere, and the moment Caesar fell, power did not return to law, it returned to fear. The Senate chamber became a place of chaos. Senators fled, some slipping on blood, others hiding behind columns. The conspirators stood trembling, unsure whether they had just liberated Rome or doomed themselves. And outside the city did not rise in celebration. It shut its doors, merchants closed shops. Citizens stayed inside, because people who have lived through civil war learned that sudden political freedom usually means violence is coming. The conspirators retreated to the Capitoline Hill, the old fortress of Rome, trying to present themselves as protectors of tradition. But tradition could not protect them now, because Caesar's supporters were not powerless, and the most dangerous among them was Mark Antony, Caesar's closest lieutenant, a man of charisma, brutality, and instinct. Antony had escaped the Senate chamber only because he was distracted at the crucial moment. And when he heard Caesar was dead, he did not charge in with soldiers. He did something smarter. He vanished, changed clothes, hid, and waited to see where the wind would blow. Because Antony understood that the first rule of survival in Rome was timing. Within hours the Senate tried to negotiate, because no one wanted immediate war. Not the senators who feared Caesar's veterans, not the conspirators who lacked armies, and not Antony who needed to gather strength. A compromise was reached. Caesar would be honored, the conspirators would be pardoned, and the state would move forward. It was a fragile agreement built on the hope that Rome could pretend nothing irreversible had happened. But then came the funeral, and funerals in Rome were political weapons. Caesar's body was carried into the forum, laid out on a golden couch, his wounds visible, his face pale. And the crowd gathered, not as citizens debating law, but as mourners hungry for meaning. Antony stepped forward to speak. And in that moment, he proved himself as dangerous as any general, because he understood the psychology of crowds. He did not begin with rage, he began with grief. He spoke softly, praising Caesar's achievements, reminding the people of his victories, his generosity, his reforms, and then slowly he turned the knife. Not into Caesar's body, but into the crowd's emotions. He held up Caesar's blood-stained toga, pointed to each tear, each stab, naming the conspirators, showing the people that their leader had been butchered not by foreign enemies, but by senators who claimed to defend liberty. And as he spoke, the crowd's grief transformed into fury, because Caesar had not been perfect, but he had been theirs. And now he was dead on the Senate floor like an animal. Antony read Caesar's will, and this was the final blow. Because Caesar had left money to every Roman citizen and had left his gardens for public use. A last gift that made his murder feel not only cruel but personal. The crowd erupted. They seized torches, built a funeral pyre in the forum itself, burned Caesar's body in uncontrolled flames. And then they surged through the streets hunting conspirators, smashing houses, chanting Caesar's name. And the liberators who had imagined themselves as heroes suddenly became prey. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome, because Rome had spoken, not through law but through mob emotion. And Caesar's death had created not freedom but martyrdom. Yet Antony's triumph was not secure, because Caesar's power had not died with him. It had been inherited, and the heir was a teenager. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew, adopted in Caesar's will, a boy studying in Greece when the assassination occurred, who now became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Octavian. And the moment he arrived in Italy, the political world shifted, because no one expected him to matter. Senators saw him as a child, Antony saw him as a tool. But Octavian was something rare, a cold mind wrapped in a young face. He did not have Antony's charisma or Caesar's battlefield legend, but he had patience, discipline, and an instinct for power that was almost frightening. He claimed Caesar's name, demanded Caesar's inheritance, and began courting Caesar's veterans, offering them loyalty and rewards. And the veterans listened, because they did not serve abstract ideals. They served the memory of the man who had led them through Gaul. And now they would serve the one who carried his name. Antony tried to dominate Octavian at first, treating him as a subordinate, but Octavian refused to be swallowed. He maneuvered between Senate and army, presenting himself as Caesar's avenger, but also as a defender of the Republic. And the Senate, desperate to use him against Antony, made the fatal mistake of empowering him. Cicero, brilliant but naive, believed Octavian could be controlled. He called him a young man sent by the gods to save Rome, and he unleashed his speeches, the Philippics, attacking Antony as a drunk tyrant, hoping to rally the Republic around Octavian. But Octavian was not saving the Republic, he was using it. War broke out. Antony fought Senate forces and Octavian's troops near Mutina. Battles were bloody, consuls died, and Octavian emerged with an army and no one left above him. He marched on Rome, demanded the consulship, and received it, not through persuasion, but through force. Then came the moment that revealed the Republic was finished. Octavian made peace with Antony, and together they formed a second triumvirate with Lepidus. Not an unofficial alliance like Caesar's first triumvirate, but a legal dictatorship with absolute power. And the first thing they did was not restore law, but purge enemies. Proscriptions returned, lists posted again, men hunted again, property seized again, and among the dead was Cicero, the great voice of the Republic, murdered, his head and hands displayed on the rostra as a warning. And Rome learned the final lesson of Caesar's assassination. Killing one dictator does not restore freedom. It creates a vacuum that stronger men fill. The triumvirs then turned east to hunt Brutus and Cassius, and the war for Caesar's legacy moved toward its climax, because the Republic's last defenders would make their final stand not in the Senate, but on a battlefield far from Rome, at Philippi. Brutus and Cassius did not flee Rome as cowards. They fled as men who had discovered too late that ideas cannot protect you from armies. And once they reached the eastern provinces, they began doing what every Roman political leader eventually had to do in the late Republic. They raised legions, because in the end the Republic was not decided by speeches, but by soldiers. The conspirators framed their cause as liberty. But liberty now required pay, supplies, and discipline. And so they taxed cities, seized treasure, demanded loyalty, and the idealism of the assassination began to harden into the same harsh realities that had corrupted every faction before them. In the East, they found support among senators and provincial elites who feared Antony and Octavian. And they gathered a powerful force, yet even as they prepared, Brutus carried a quiet sorrow, because he had not wanted civil war. He had wanted restoration, and now he was marching toward another Roman battlefield, another river of Roman blood. Cassius was more realistic, more bitter. He believed the Republic had already died, and they were fighting for dignity rather than hope. And across the sea, Antony and Octavian moved with the relentless certainty of men who knew they were the future. Their alliance was uneasy. Antony despised Octavian's youth and coldness. Octavian feared Antony's popularity with soldiers, but both understood they needed each other to destroy the assassins and claim Caesar's legacy. They crossed into Greece and advanced toward Macedonia. And in 42 BC, the two forces met near Philippi, a plain surrounded by hills and marshland, where dust rose under thousands of marching feet and the sky seemed to hold its breath. It was not merely a battle for revenge. It was the battle for Rome's identity. Because if Brutus and Cassius won, the Senate might regain authority. But if Antony and Octavian won, Rome would move irreversibly toward monarchy. The first battle erupted with confusion and fury. Brutus attacked Octavian's camp and broke through, driving his forces back, while Cassius fought Antony and was pushed into retreat. Dust and smoke made the battlefield unreadable. Messengers failed, signals were lost, and Cassius, believing Brutus had been defeated, fell into despair. He ordered his servant to kill him, dying not in defeat but in misunderstanding. And with Cassius dead, the Republican cause lost its hardest mind. Brutus continued fighting for weeks, but he could feel the weight of fate. His army was strong, yet morale was fragile, and he knew Antony's veterans were relentless. The second battle came like a final wave. Antony and Octavian pressed hard. The Republican lines broke, and Brutus, surrounded by the ruins of his dream, chose death rather than capture. He ran on his own sword, dying as his ancestor once swore Rome would never again bow to kings. Antony, standing over Brutus' body, is said to have treated him with respect, covering him with a cloak, because even victors sometimes honor the tragedy of their enemies. But respect did not bring back the Republic, with Brutus and Cassius dead. Caesar's assassins were gone, and Rome's last hope of returning to its old system died with them. Yet victory did not bring peace, because Antony and Octavian were not partners in a restored republic. They were rivals dividing the conquered world. The triumvirate split the Roman territories like spoils. Antony took the east, rich, glamorous, filled with ancient kingdoms and endless money. Octavian took the west, Italy, Gaul, Spain, the hard lands that held Rome's veterans and the restless urban masses. Lepidus was given Africa, a quiet share that made him look like an afterthought. And slowly Lepidus became exactly that. Pushed aside, stripped of power, leaving only Antony and Octavian, two men now destined to repeat the cycle Caesar began. Rivalry turning to war, but first Antony returned to the east, where wealth and temptation waited, and where Cleopatra, still ruling Egypt, watched Rome's chaos with the calm eyes of someone who understood that empires rise and fall, but Egypt endures. Antony met Cleopatra at Tarsus in 41 BC, and the meeting became legend. Cleopatra arrived not as a humble client queen, but as a living spectacle. Her barge sailed up the river with purple sails, incense drifting, musicians playing, and she reclined like Aphrodite made flesh. Because Cleopatra understood that power is theater. And Antony, a man who loved excess, fell under her spell. But it was not merely seduction, it was alliance. Cleopatra offered Antony money, ships, support, and in return, Antony offered her protection, legitimacy, and the possibility of expanding Egypt's influence. Their relationship became a fusion of politics and desire, and for a time Antony lived as if Rome no longer mattered, holding feasts, wearing Eastern dress, drinking, hunting, and presenting himself almost like a Hellenistic king. And in Rome, this was poison, because Rome's identity was built on contempt for Eastern luxury, on the belief that Romans were disciplined while Greeks and Egyptians were decadent. Octavian saw the opportunity immediately. Because Octavian's greatest weapon was not battlefield courage, it was propaganda. He began crafting a narrative. Antony had betrayed Rome. Antony had been enslaved by a foreign queen. Antony would bring monarchy and Eastern corruption to the Republic. And the Roman people, already uneasy, began to believe it, because it fit their fears. Meanwhile, Octavian struggled in Italy, settling veterans, facing land confiscations, rebellions, hunger, and political unrest. But he endured. He married strategically, built alliances, and presented himself as the defender of Roman tradition, the son of Caesar, the man who would restore order. And slowly he gained what Antony was losing: legitimacy, the sense that he belonged to Rome itself. The rivalry intensified. Treaties were made and broken. Antony married Octavian's sister Octavia to seal peace, but he abandoned her for Cleopatra, confirming Octavian's narrative. And when Antony publicly recognized Caesarion as Caesar's true heir and granted territories to Cleopatra's children in the donations of Alexandria, it was the final insult, because it looked like Antony was dividing Rome's empire for an Egyptian dynasty. Octavian seized Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins, read it aloud to the Senate, revealing Antony's desire to be buried in Alexandria. And Rome erupted in outrage, because even if the will was private, Octavian made it political, turning Antony into a traitor in the public imagination. War became inevitable, but Octavian was careful. He did not declare war on Antony directly, because Antony was still a Roman, and Romans feared another civil war. Instead, he declared war on Cleopatra, framing the conflict as Rome versus a foreign queen. And in doing so, he turned the coming battle into a moral crusade, a defense of Roman identity. And as fleets gathered and banners rose, the final struggle for Caesar's legacy approached its climax not in Italy, but at sea, near the western coast of Greece, at Actium. Actium was not only a battle of ships, it was a battle of narratives. Because by 31 BC, the Roman world was exhausted from decades of civil war and desperate for someone to end the chaos. And Octavian understood that victory would belong not only to the stronger fleet, but to the man who could convince Rome he was fighting for its soul. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in the Greek West. Their fleet vast, their resources immense. But their alliance was fragile. Antony's Roman officers resented Cleopatra's influence. Cleopatra's Egyptians feared Roman betrayal. And even within Antony's camp, there was doubt. Because Antony's image as Caesar's great lieutenant had faded into something softer and more dangerous. A man who seemed to have traded Roman discipline for Eastern luxury. Octavian's forces, commanded by his brilliant general Agrippa, moved with ruthless efficiency, cutting Antony's supply lines, harassing his fleet, starving his camp, and turning time itself into a weapon. Disease spread among Antony's men. Morale collapsed and desertions increased. Because soldiers follow strength, and strength at Actium seemed to belong to Octavian. The battle came on September 2, 31 BC. Under a harsh sun and a restless wind, Antony's ships were large and heavy, floating fortresses with towers, designed for ramming and boarding. Cleopatra's fleet waited behind, sleek and fast, while Octavian's ships were lighter, more maneuverable. Commanded by experienced crews who had trained for this moment, the sea became a battlefield of smoke, splintering wood, screams, and burning pitch. And yet the decisive moment was not a heroic charge, but a collapse of cohesion. Cleopatra, seeing the battle turning uncertain, broke formation and fled with her ships through a gap in the fighting. And Antony, whether from love, panic, or calculation, followed her, abandoning much of his fleet and leaving his men to fight without their commander. It was a moment so shocking, it destroyed the last remnants of Antony's authority. His remaining forces surrendered or were destroyed, and Octavian's victory became complete. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, clinging to the hope that they could regroup, negotiate, or survive. But Octavian pursued them with the cold patience of a man who knew the world was already his. He marched into Egypt in 30 BC, and Alexandria, once a city of splendor, became a city of dread. Antony's supporters deserted him. His soldiers surrendered, and Antony, hearing a false rumor that Cleopatra was dead, chose suicide. He fell on his sword, but did not die immediately. And in his final hours, he was carried to Cleopatra's monument, where she held him as he bled. A tragic scene of power collapsing into helplessness. Antony died in her arms, and Cleopatra, now alone, faced Octavian. She tried to charm him as she had charmed Caesar and Antony. But Octavian was not a man who could be seduced. He was a man who could only be negotiated with. And negotiation required leverage. Cleopatra had none. She realized Octavian would take her to Rome as a captive trophy, parading her in triumph as the symbol of foreign decadence defeated by Roman virtue. And she refused. She chose death. Whether by asp, poison, or hidden blade, the exact method is uncertain. But the meaning is clear. Cleopatra died as she lived, controlling the story, refusing humiliation. And with her death, the last great independent kingdom of the Hellenistic world fell under Rome's control. Egypt became a Roman possession, its wealth flowing into Octavian's hands. And Octavian returned to Rome not as a dictator in crisis, but as the undisputed master of the Roman world. Yet he understood what Caesar had not: that Rome would never accept a king openly. The word rex was still poison. So Octavian did not crown himself, he performed humility. He restored the appearance of republican institutions while keeping all real power for himself. He took the title Augustus, the revered one. And he became princeps, first citizen, a phrase that sounded modest but meant absolute authority. The republic did not officially die in a single moment. It dissolved quietly into empire, and Rome accepted it because Rome was tired. Because stability felt like salvation, because Augustus promised peace. And he delivered it. The Pax Romana began. And the world entered an age shaped by emperors, not senators. And yet at the center of this transformation remained the shadow of Julius Caesar. Because Caesar's assassination had not saved the republic. It had created the martyr whose name became a throne. Caesar's life proved that one man could bend Rome's system through war, popularity, and ruthless intelligence. His death proved that violence could not restore what history had already eroded. And his legacy proved that Rome, for all its hatred of kings, would always end up creating them, because an empire cannot be governed by committees forever. And as Augustus stood at the summit of power, he carried Caesar's name as both inheritance and warning. A reminder that the Republic had not been destroyed by one man's ambition alone, but by the Republic's inability to control the ambitions it created. And so Caesar's story ends where it began, with a question larger than any battlefield: was Caesar the destroyer of the Republic, or the product of a republic that had already destroyed itself? And the answer is not simple, because Caesar was both. A man of extraordinary talent and extraordinary ruthlessness. A reformer and a conqueror, a liberator to some and a tyrant to others. And in the end, his greatest victory was not Gaul, not Pharsalus, not Egypt, but the transformation of Rome itself. From a fragile aristocratic republic into an imperial machine that would dominate the world for centuries. And in that transformation, the knives of the Ides of March did not stop Caesar, they made him eternal. But even after Actium and the suicides of Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar's story did not end, because Caesar was no longer just a man. He had become an idea, a symbol, a weapon, and in Rome symbols were more dangerous than swords. Octavian understood this better than anyone alive, because he had not defeated Antony only with ships and soldiers. He had defeated him with meaning, by framing the war as Rome versus the East, discipline versus decadence, duty versus desire. And now he would use Caesar's memory the same way. Carefully, strategically, like a blade hidden inside velvet. He returned to Rome and began reshaping the state without appearing to touch it. He repaired temples, revived old religious ceremonies, restored festivals, spoke constantly about tradition and morality, because Rome wanted to believe it was still Rome, that the chaos had been an exception, not the truth, and Augustus gave them that comfort. He did not call himself dictator, he refused the crown. He staged public gestures of humility. He claimed he was simply returning power to the Senate and the people. But every move was calculated, because behind the stagecraft he held the army, the treasury and the provinces, and those were the real levers of the world. The Senate still met, still debated, still issued decrees. But now it debated inside a cage made of invisible bars. Because Augustus could veto, appoint, reward, and punish without ever raising his voice. The Republic's language remained, but its soul had changed. And the engine of that change was Caesar's legacy. Because Caesar had shown that Rome's system could be bypassed, that popularity could overpower aristocratic tradition, that legions loyal to a commander could outweigh laws written on marble. And so Augustus kept Caesar close. He completed Caesar's projects. He built the Forum of Caesar. He finished the temple promised to Venus Genetrix. He placed Caesar among the gods, officially deifying him as Divus Julius. And by doing so, he elevated himself, because if Caesar was a god, then Augustus was the son of a god, Divi Filius. And that single phrase carried the weight of destiny. It was not just propaganda, it was psychological conquest. Because Rome was a city that respected lineage, omens, sacred legitimacy, and Augustus wrapped himself in all of it. He made Caesar's comet a sign. He made Caesar's murder a tragedy that demanded closure. And he positioned himself as the man who had delivered that closure. Not through revenge alone, but through order. Through peace, through stability, yet the irony was brutal. Because the very men who had killed Caesar in the name of freedom had not restored freedom at all. They had accelerated the birth of empire.
Brutus and Cassius died believing they had failed, and in a sense they were right, because Caesar's assassination did not revive the Republic. It exposed how hollow the Republic had become. It revealed that the old system could not survive the new realities of wealth, conquest, and military power. The Republic had been built for a city-state, not a Mediterranean empire, and by Caesar's time the machinery of governance was ancient, slow, corrupted, unable to control the forces it had unleashed. The Senate was meant to be a council of elders guiding Rome through wisdom and restraint, but it had become a battlefield of egos, factions, and private interests. Elections were purchased, courts were manipulated, governors looted provinces like personal treasure chests, and the people, the ordinary Romans, were trapped between elite violence and economic desperation. Land had concentrated into the hands of the rich, small farmers were displaced, veterans returned from wars to find their homes gone. The city flooded with unemployed men who lived on grain distributions and the promise of strong leaders. And in that world, Caesar's rise was not an accident. It was almost inevitable, because when institutions fail, individuals fill the vacuum. Caesar had been the first to fully grasp this, to see that Rome's laws were not sacred barriers, but tools, and he used them with the calm confidence of a man who believed history belonged to the bold. But he also miscalculated, because he believed he could reshape Rome and still be loved. He believed that his genius would make his rule acceptable, and he underestimated how deeply the Roman elite feared monarchy, not because they loved freedom in some pure philosophical sense, but because monarchy meant they would no longer be first. And in Rome, losing status was worse than death, and so they killed him. Yet even in death, Caesar won, because his name became the title of emperors. Caesar became a crown without metal, a word that meant authority, and in later centuries it would evolve into Kaiser and Tsar, echoes of one man's ambition traveling through time. But the most haunting part of Caesar's legacy is that it forces a question that still burns in every republic that ever existed. What happens when a state cannot reform itself peacefully? What happens when corruption becomes normal, when law becomes theater, when politics becomes a game for the wealthy, when the people stop believing that the system represents them? Caesar answered with action, with force, with speed. He broke the rules because he believed the rules were already broken, and many Romans agreed because his reforms were real. He expanded citizenship. He reorganized debt. He built public works. He punished corrupt governors. He tried to stabilize the grain supply. He reformed the calendar itself, creating the Julian calendar that still shapes our time today. And yet every reform came with a price, because each one increased his personal authority. Each one made Rome more dependent on a single will, and that dependency is the seed of empire. Augustus learned from Caesar's mistake. He understood that power must be hidden to survive, that dictatorship must wear the mask of tradition, and so he ruled longer than Caesar ever could, because he made Rome believe it was choosing what had already been decided. And for the next 2 centuries, Rome would enjoy relative peace under emperors. Roads built, trade expanded, borders secured, cities flourishing, and many would say this proved that Caesar and Augustus were right, that the Republic had been chaos and the empire was stability. But stability is not the same as justice, and Rome would pay later, because when power is concentrated in one man, the quality of the state depends on the quality of that man. And after Augustus came emperors who were wise and emperors who were monsters, and the machinery Caesar created could not protect Rome from the madness of those who inherited it. And so Caesar's story becomes not only the story of one man's rise and fall, but the story of a civilization reaching the limits of its political imagination. And when you look back at the Ides of March, at Caesar collapsing beneath Pompey's statue, at the senators standing frozen with blood on their hands, you can feel the tragedy in full, because they believed they were saving Rome, but Rome was already gone, and what replaced it was not freedom reborn, but an empire born from the ashes of a republic that could no longer govern the world it had conquered.